I have one of these microphones that doesn't actually make any sound in the room, but it exists for our live stream. So if it looks like it's not doing anything, it's not true. It's doing something for other people. Welcome to today's Kinder Colloquium. It is my pleasure to be introducing our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Daniel Rowe. Dr. Rowe is the Director of Academic Programs at the Rothermere American Institute, the RAI, at the University of Oxford, where he is also an associate member of the Faculty of History and a research associate at University College, Oxford. He has been visiting with us a little bit longer than most of our speakers over the last couple days, and it's been completely full of events, in large part because he is on board to be helping us launch and run the new Kinder RAI Oxford Summer School that is beginning for the first time this summer. So for those of you who may not know about this, this is a opportunity that basically uniquely enables cohorts of our students here from Mizzou to go completely immerse themselves in Oxford, in the university and in the place for a full month in the summer, be taught by faculty from the University of Oxford, and then get MU credit for their trouble. Many of you in the Kinder Institute would probably be aware that when it comes to transatlantic partnerships, there is a whole number of centuries of examples of it being challenging, and there being all sorts of pitfalls when it comes to be bringing these two places together. But working with Dan over the last year or so, absolute masterclass in showing how smoothly and well these kinds of partnerships actually can work, even for people as foolhardy as us who think that we can bring these two completely kind of different educational systems together in the 21st century. It is a challenge, but it can work smoothly, and that's really because we're lucky to be working with Dan in that sense. A bit more about him, of course. Dr. Rowe kicked off his academic career as an undergraduate in history at the University of Sheffield, and then followed that with a master's in American history, and then a DPhil, a doctorate in American history at the University of Oxford. Before taking on his current post at the RAI, he also served at Oxford as a research associate on the Global History of Capitalism project and as a departmental lecturer in US history and government, alongside some teaching stints elsewhere as well at the universities of Sheffield, Warwick, and at Birkbeck University in London. Dan is an expert in 20th century US history and its connections to the wider world, particularly in the realms of political economy, trade, and policy making. And his forthcoming book that is coming out through Columbia University Press, and in which we will hear a lot of the themes about this afternoon, is entitled State of Development: Preserving the American Economic Century in an Era of Anxious Capitalism. So the themes that he explores in that book and that we'll hear about, as I said this afternoon: protectionism, economic nationalism, the waxing and waning of the appeal of free trade ideals in moments of economic turmoil. Anything, right? Anything if not very, very timely in this very specific day that we are lucky enough to have him here. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure to be here over the last, I guess it's 48 hours, and I want to thank Billy for that kind introduction. It's been a wonderful 48 hours. I arrived on Wednesday evening. The sun was setting. It was about 70 degrees outside. I could see the horizon for it felt miles and miles, and I was charmed instantly by being here. Subsequent to that, I've had meetings with everyone and Jay's dog, and in those meetings, particularly the meeting with Jay's dog, I was blown away and impressed by students, the work that I've read, the work that I've had the pleasure of discussing with students while I'm here, the other interaction that I've had with students, and impressed by what the Kinder has built and what the Honours College is doing in partnership with Kinder for the summer school, and everything else. And that only makes me more excited for what Billy mentioned, which is the summer school in Oxford that we're building together, and I'm excited to welcome those 20 Mizzou students to Oxford in July. As I've said, this is in many ways a trip of firsts. This is my first time in Missouri, at least my first time in Missouri when I haven't flown into St. Louis Airport and instantly got on a shuttle to Carbondale, Illinois. So I didn't really stop in Illinois. This was my first time eating chicken fried steak. Questions about that at the end. I could go on, but more pertinently, this is my first time delivering an academic talk at about 8:45 in the evening, at least as far as my body clock is telling me. My circadian rhythm might be set to Oxford time, which is 5 minutes faster than GMT for anyone who actually follows those things. But my scholarly and historical home is firmly rooted, as Billy said, in the 20th century. For any students in the audience, that was a horrible transition. Do better with transitions than that one. But I'm a historian, as Billy said, of the post-1930s US and the wider world. In particular, I'm interested in state market relations, political coalitions, and policy making during that time. I teach widely, of course, beyond those time periods in Oxford, beyond those geographical areas. I cross themes, I even cross disciplines if political science wants me, and sometimes it does, it doesn't always. And I think that's good and healthy for creativity and the imagination and inspiration. I think that's one of the excellent things about, say, the MA program here that I was talking to students about a little time ago. But when I'm not teaching, my research and writing energies are firmly focused right now on finishing the book project that Billy mentioned. It's not going to have that title because that title's horrible. It's stacking too many concepts on top of each other. But nonetheless, the topic remains the same, and it's that book project that I want to talk to you about this afternoon or evening, depending on the time zone that you happen to find yourself in at this moment in time. Now, the book primarily focuses on a 20-year period from 1973, the onset of the first energy crisis of the 1970s, to around 1993, which I would define as the sort of onset of what I'm going to call the unipolar moment in this talk. We could fight about that afterwards, but I'm making a historical claim right there. There's always a caveat, of course, with a historian and a scholar, and that is that a week or two ago I was in Boston. Unfortunately, I had to return to Oxford in the meantime, so that's why I'm on Oxford time. But I presented a pre-circulated draft of what I hope will be the final chapter and epilogue of the book, and that really looked at 1985 to 2015, so I'm happy to talk about that as well. But nonetheless, the meat of the book, it's focused on what I've just talked about, that 1973 to roughly 1993 moment. Let's just call it the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s. Much changed in US and global politics, culture and society during this time. But what I want to suggest to you is that in one crucial respect, I think it was a time of continuity. And that continuity was that economic issues dominated the national conversation in the United States, but also actually in many other places, but I'm a historian of the US and wider world, so I'll focus on the US. But it dominated the national conversation in a way that it had not done since the 1930s. Iconic industries and corporations which had powered America's explosive rise to global preeminence in the late 19th century and early 20th century were engulfed in crisis. Prices, interest rates and unemployment climbed, food and energy prices soared, and even when the economy was not in recession, growth was sluggish and uneven. Economic issues were, as these Time magazine covers show you. I'm going to show you a lot of Time magazine covers, and I'm just going to say here I don't earn any commission for that, lest you think, but they're sort of evocative of the moment. But as these Time magazine covers, it's seldom out of the news. I've sort of gone, I think, chronologically from the top row along. And I think one of the most striking things that we can see is we've got which is coincidentally why I've put them in this way, we've got a 1975 cover there, Can Capitalism Survive? We've got a 1980 cover, Is Capitalism Working? There is some change of time in the story, as you can probably tell, that I've given you mostly 1970s and 1980s in this, or early 1980s in the stories. The mid-1980s did look a bit different from some perspectives. The economy, the US economy did grow. There was a rising enthusiasm, even sort of computer mania, as I call it in that final chapter, that existed there about the information technology revolution and the revival of cities. So I could present to you some optimistic magazine covers from that time if I wanted to, but I wanted to stick with pessimism today. But what I will suggest to you is, even in that time, many of the psychological anxieties that I'm going to talk to you about US capitalism, and it is US capitalism. If we looked at that cover and analysed that cover as a source, we can see the dollar signs, we can see Wall Street. I'm not going to turn this into a primary source discussion, but it would be a great one to write about. And what are those anxieties? Well, it's a persistent fear that the power and global economic primacy of the US is declining, that it might be being eclipsed. It might be being eclipsed by a capitalist rival. And there was no rerun, in other words, even during that period of growth, of the optimism and perhaps even the hubris that existed in the United States about economic issues during the 1950s and the 1970s. Many questioned how, when, or even if recovery would arrive, and voiced fears of national decline. Now, I don't really want to labour this too much because I want to get to the meat of the paper and tell you some stories, but this is a totally sane graphic that I put together just to show you and think with you about some of the key events that animate the book project. And what I've really tried to do in a very bad way with that graphic is dramatise to you how thick and fast these issues came and how overlapping they are, right? You can't quite pick out the different colours. I rigidly stuck to this sort of pale red, which may have been a mistake, but how overlapping and everything they are, what the dates of everything that has happened for. I hope that gives a way of sort of dramatising what this looked like to those not just reading the economics or business section of newspapers, but what it meant to people looking at front pages, these cascading or overlapping industrial and financial crises that seem to happen, as I've said, all at once and seem almost out of control. Now, Gerald Ford famously, when he took the presidency in 1974 after Watergate, declared that America's long national nightmare was over. I'll put it to you tonight in a horrible, cringy sentence, but that if the nightmare of Watergate was ending, a new, much longer nightmare was beginning that would not really elapse into kind of the great dreams of the 1960s, even to our present day perhaps, but also definitely not until the mid-1990s. Lots of the memories of that time, lots of the relics of that time exist and continue to reverberate beneath the surface in the time since. So let me actually talk to you specifically about the things that I'm writing about and the things that I'm interested in, and go a bit beyond a sort of broad overview. This is perhaps a bit too schematic, but what is it that the broader research project is trying to do, and by extension, of course, what is it not trying to do? Well, it's not a synthetic overview. It's not a sort of decadal book. Many great decadal books exist for the 1970s and 1980s. But what it's trying to do is to think about what comes into view by thinking across eras, but also, of course, making the point and making the case that there are things that we miss by focusing on the traditional eras that we often focused on. And as I've said, for whatever reason, historically, that's often been decades for the post-1960s. And I'm aware that I talk in decades, which might be an illustration of how much that remains. And what I want to do with the research project is doing is hopefully providing a nuanced and archivally informed accounts of policy making, state building, and political economy through the time that I'm talking about. It examines events and debates only lightly touched on in most existing histories, things that get a sentence or two, but actually loom very large in the moment and occupied a lot of attention. And it treats the 1980 election in particular not as an opening or a closing scene, but as a midpoint in this tumultuous era of crisis that I want to talk to you about today, because there is a strong tendency with a lot of scholarship to sort of let the credits roll, as I sometimes say, once we reach the 1980 election. But I want to sort of think with you about that. So you've got some more generic bullet points that you've probably read by now about what is it that the project is about, what is it doing, what is it not doing. Now, what I want to do with you in the next sort of looks at my clock, 25 or so minutes, perhaps a bit less, perhaps a bit more, is to talk to you from a 38,000 foot point of view. I picked that because I noticed that's what my 787 was flying at on the way to Chicago. We seem to be maintaining 38,000 feet. But to think about some of the overarching stories that the project brings to light, of course, by its very nature, what that means is this will be quite broad brushstrokes. That the analytical telling will loom larger than the evidentiary showing, but I'm happy to deepen that in important ways. But what I want to do is to try and give you a holistic, a non-blow-by-blow approach about the macro stories that I see animating this period. So I should have got to the blank screen before, but that's all right. One thing that we might expect about this, and we might imagine, is a story of paralysis and confusion. It's almost as if I planned this in advance. Is a tale of uncertainty, indecision, changing policies, or if you have any familiarity with the political thinking during the Great Depression era, what some people sometimes refer to as the mature economy thesis of the 1930s. There certainly is a story here you can tell to that degree. And as I've shown you with some even more time covers, I think this is just about, you've had definitely the most of them by now, is that there is a story to be told here, that there is a broader overarching story about sort of feeling that macroeconomic policy, taxation, spending, monetary policy as well, that there needs to be a solution. 3 different presidents are constantly grappling with this. And there does seem a sort of growing horror, as I've said, and sort of seemingly no way out of this, this doom loop. It's almost sort of not worth following how many different economic plans Jimmy Carter unveils during his presidency, because they sort of almost come on a month-by-month basis. The historian Carl Bivin sort of charts that quite well, but as I said, it's sort of thick and fast, but so too Congress is pushing its own ideas, its own policy approaches during this time. There is a sort of sense of complete reversal, often month to month, as to what the approach is going to be. So here we can see this dramatized. Of course, former Vice President Hubert Humphrey, then just a senator in 1975, saying that it's obvious to me that the old economic rules no longer apply. This sense that the wheels had come off the post-war economic boom, that the solutions of the past aren't going to work in the same way. And I think we can see similar sentiments here. This is a bit gratuitous, this slide, because it's one of those archival finds that just makes you laugh in the archive when you come across it. Gerald Rafshun is sort of Jimmy Carter's PR man, and he writes this memo sort of basically just saying, stop smiling. People are getting annoyed by it for all the reasons that you've got there, but dramatizing that this is, why are they getting annoyed about it? Because of the grim state of the economy. So now that's one way, as I said, that we could tell this story, and I think it's one way that the story is often told, a story of a sort of policy vacuum, policy indecision that exists. And a classic way of telling this story, we're just going to go back, is to sort of frame this as a policy vacuum where there is one solution. Margaret Thatcher's famous comment that there is no alternative, we might repurpose it here to there was no alternative. Dr. Sexton knows this napkin well because he referenced it in a recent Zoom call, albeit he said it was about tariffs and it's actually about income tax. But I think he I think he knew it. The famous Arthur Laffer, the economist and commentator Napkin, saying that after a certain level of income tax, government revenue declines. So there is, as I said, a way that we could tell this story about a cocktail of macroeconomic turbulence, cascading crises in the automobile, the steel industries, the nation's largest cities, and the economic success of other countries, creating this sense of national crisis and a sense that there's no path, and that the only people who did see an alternative path was a group of conservative policy entrepreneurs, members of the business community who we would often see as sort of quasi-libertarian, intellectuals and economists who'd been ideologically committed to rolling back the New Deal state ever since its inception, ever since really 1933. And there is a tale that can be told here. There's many people who've told this tale, and it is compelling. It has some grounding in reality, because for this group, the source of America's economic poor performance was quite obvious, and it was the source that they'd been touting ever since 1933 in a way. It was high taxes and burdensome government regulations. Government policies, they insisted, had discouraged entrepreneurs, investors and corporations from making the investments that were required to increase particularly productivity rates. For those not familiar, I mean, the basic way of describing a productivity rate is just to say what one person can do in an hour's worth of work. It's much more complicated than that in reality, but for our purposes, let's just leave it there. But that this was, as I've said, that government regulations, taxation, everything else. And for this movement of leading conservative or movement of conservative movement activists, curing America's economic woes was simply a matter of lowering taxes, strengthening intellectual property rights, giving incentives for certain activities, and cutting regulations. And the avatar of this movement, of course, and the popular popularizer was Ronald Reagan, who insisted on the campaign trail that in 1980, that curing America's economic woes was simply a matter of changes in the federal tax structure and everything else. Now, it is true, of course, that the Reagan administration in 1981 did come into office and make big economic policy decisions, particularly on a macroeconomic level, the biggest non-military spending cut in US history, a massive across-the-board tax cut, repeal of regulations. But one thing that I want to say to you here is to say that, as you can see from a slightly more zoomed in, I think I actually added something to this slightly unhinged graphic, is to say that this didn't end, right? The famous morning in America didn't come. The 1982 recession, or 1981 to 1982 recession, was deeper and more prolonged than any recession since the Great Depression, beating 73 to 75. And this is, as I've said, a time of rising interest rates, a time in which unemployment climbed to double digits and stubbornly remained there for the next 10 months. And making matters even worse, at least in the short term, the Federal Reserve's decision to raise interest rates to nearly 20%, and I'm making a sweeping summary of interest rates there. I know that, but I'm just going to acknowledge it and move on. Paralyzed financial markets and heaped further pain on the already struggling US automobile, steel, and home building industries in that very moment. Yes, that's a story. That's a story. It's an important story. It's one that has clear, lingering ramifications that shapes our current world in important ways, that shapes the 1990s in important ways. But the other thing that I want to say to you, and this is really, really getting to the story, is that when it came to policies at a more granular and even sectoral level, it's possible to tell quite a different story. It's possible, I think, to tell a story that may be surprising to many, and it's possible to tell a story that, at least to a Brit, seems very ironic in many circumstances. I say this, there's times when I wonder if some of the actors I'm writing about see the sense of irony in what they're saying, and I often just put it down to national differences about seeing irony, but that's a slight aside. But it's this second story, this secular story that I want, or sectoral story, sorry, that I want to spend some time with you discussing. Now, as I've talked to you about, there is an idealized relationship in rhetoric at this time about the relationship between the market, whatever the market means, and the state, and it's everywhere. Free enterprise talk is literally, you find it everywhere, and as I've said, often in very ironic situations. But sometimes it was only merely rhetorical, and sometimes it's taking place rhetorically whilst other things are happening behind the scenes. Let me furnish you with two quick examples here that animate their own chapters in the book that I'm writing. The first is the famous New York City fiscal crisis of 1975. I'm not going to narrate the story here, but in March 1975, institutional investors essentially decide that they're no longer going to buy any of New York City's bonds. This puts New York City into immediate financial crisis because it relies on rolling over its debts on a month-by-month or quarter-by-quarter scenario. It throws it, as I've said, into immediate crisis. Can it even meet its payroll? And the answer is no, not without additional help. For 9 months, New York City puts together piecemeal patchwork solutions, borrowing money from the state, from New York state government, persuading municipal unions to buy some bonds, a variety of patchwork solutions. But really there are only two longer term solutions to this story, at least if it's going to avoid defaulting on its debts. That is either that these institutional investors will start buying, private institutional investors of course will start rebuying the bonds, or that the federal government will step in, provide it with the long-term help that it needs. State government and the municipal unions simply don't have the financial resources to solve this problem in the longer term. Now, famously, Gerald Ford, the president at the time, perhaps the most famous tabloid headline in US history, the New York Daily News, Ford to City Drop Dead, he famously plays hardball over this. He famously says, very vocally declares that he's not going to provide any of the assistance, and he will block any congressional attempt to pass this because there's a congressional story here. But while memorable, I think that New York Daily News headline should not be taken entirely at face value, even as the Ford administration carefully cultivated the image that it was prepared to let New York City drop dead, and it did very carefully cultivate that image. It closely monitored the situation on the ground, and it used the prospect of potential federal aid to influence the city's restructuring, even before it provided loan guarantees. It deployed, in other words, the disciplining powers at its disposal to reshape New York City's public sector and eliminate municipal spending that it considered profligate. This federally enforced austerity regime that was enacted through mainly something called the Municipal Assistance Corporation, or MAC, sometimes called Big Mac. I don't know what it reflects about me, that it took me ages to get the joke. And then I sort of thought I was very stupid when I finally understood why everyone found Big Mac so funny. But it stayed in place for 11 years as this public-private agency, let's keep calling it Big Mac, created to oversee New York City's finance, continued to place strict conditions on the city's taxation and spending. And I could talk much more about the members of this board and everything else, but that's just to say from this angle, the 1970s and 1980s were not decades of urban policy devolution and decentralization for America's largest city and its residents. In fact, in some ways, quite the opposite. State power is deployed here in important ways to shape and determine the austerity regime that is put in place. And if you look at the archives, it's very clear. Now, a similar set of circumstances unfolded in 1980 when the world's 14th largest corporation, the Chrysler company, was on the brink of bankruptcy. I'm not again going to narrate this crisis, but safe to say Chrysler was not in good financial condition before the onset of the second energy crisis in late 1979 of all the big three automakers in the United States. And its fortunes went from bad to worse as consumer demand for new automobiles dried up almost overnight, and in part because the only consumer demand that existed for automobile purchases in that period of time was for small vehicles and vehicles that Chrysler actually couldn't manufacture at that point in time. A similar story plays out here. The federal government here during the Carter administration enacts a set of loan guarantees passed by Congress, supported vigorously by Congress. I trace this battle in the chapter on this, and supported vigorously. Opposition to this move is actually pretty tepid. Even someone like Barry Goldwater on the floor of the Senate declares that this will be the greatest breach of the American free enterprise system in history. This is the day before the vote. He's not in Washington the day of the vote. So I think that's one of the great dramatizations of this. And as I said, there's much more that I could talk here. And what I said, just to demonstrate this, what I said about the rhetorical element, again, when the Carter administration signs this bill into law with much fanfare with many different parties there, Carter in his speech says this will be the greatest test of the American free enterprise system. Chrysler will rescue itself from this. And it's just given the largest bailout at that time in US history. So to me, how you can say that and not quite smile is its own story. But this goes beyond this, because actually a very similar set of restructuring positions were put in place. Chrysler was in effect a partially nationalized corporation for much of the early 1980s. It was provided with $1.2 billion in federal guaranteed loans that it wouldn't have been able to access afterwards, otherwise. But not only was this market failure prevented, but the promise of assistance from Washington, much like in New York City, was used to leverage further aid from organized labor, primarily the United Automobile Workers, but others as well, state governments, and the financial industry itself. Donald Regan, the Treasury Secretary, rings up Walter Wriston, the head of Citibank, during this time, and essentially says that he'll make an announcement that Walter Wriston is blocking, is about to force Chrysler to go bankrupt, and effectively threatened Citibank and Walter Wriston behind the scenes in this phone call, that he's going to play havoc, presumably, with Citibank stock prices in so doing. So that's a sort of small example of it. So I could talk much more about these examples and the stories, but just to say that even at the time, these interventions did not go unnoticed. Many did acknowledge that the American automobile industry of the 1980s was a creature in many ways shaped by the state, and took note of the sectoral specific policies deployed. In fact, when the national economic environment was at its most gloomiest, influential organizations and individuals suggested that essentially this model should be rolled out more broadly. This is the great national industrial policy debate of the early 1980s, that all of these people on screen, Lee Iacocca's autobiography, Lee Iacocca, the boss of Chrysler, that's the best-selling non-fiction book in 1984 and 1985. As a consequence, you can pick up second-hand copies for about $1. It's not a bad read for $1. But all of these people, including, you can even see the Reagan administration here debating in its own internal memo traffic, considering sectoral specific policies, the active use of trade policy levers, fiscal policy levers, and regulatory policy levers to try and boost and nurture specific terms. This was sort of short-lived but intense, and there's one way of construing this, as I've put there, which is the dog that didn't bark. Dr. Sexton's dog didn't bark yesterday either. But I think there's another way of thinking of this, and it is true that this died down in the mid-1980s, and I'm happy to talk about change over time in that story, that Paul Krugman's prediction in the summer of 1983, that at some point in the next decade the US will probably adopt a more explicit, and explicit is carrying a lot of weight there, industrial policy, never came to pass. But sort of behind the scenes and at a state policy level and everything else, there are a set of specific targeted initiatives, not just to prevent market failures like New York City and Chrysler, but to nurture select domestic producers. At a state level, we have various attempts to create sort of entrepreneurial laboratories to boost homegrown startup businesses. This is part of the entrepreneurial boom of this period. The sort of one day I'll work for myself mantra that Benjamin Waterhouse has recently written a book about this, financing biotech, providing supported loans, developing strategic development plans for individual states, but also in the realm of computing, I think, and this gets back to my tech mania or computer mania conversation. Earlier, a semiconductor cartel was essentially constructed in the mid-1980s, which went by the name of Semitech, in which US corporations and only US semiconductor corporations collaborated to try and develop new production technologies together and reduce the risk. Alongside that, there's also a set of policies, as I've hinted at, to restrict competition, a set of policies to restrict particularly Japanese competition. Again, this sense of rivalry, this sense of a capitalist rival. We often think of this period as a period of free trade, but as I can show you in this circumstance, even Time is talking about it with the trade wars. There's another trade wars cover that they do in this time. But various imports to the United States are restricted and negotiated at this time. The steel industry has a floor put on steel imports. This shapes and changes over time. I could talk about this much more. So does the automobile industry. For 4 years in the 1980s, the automobile industry has import restrictions. So too does the apparel, the ball bearing, the colour television, the footwear and motorcycle industries, and other proposals exist in 1985 to 1987 to enact other trade restrictions, and I'm not going to go into the story of how that changes, but there's various policies that are circulating then, sectoral specific policies, including one, and this is my favourite, to restrict imports of waterbed mattresses. I've always wanted to know what the big waterbed mattress story is and if there's a lobby group from it, but lots of different bills circulating, upwards of 200, such that one reporter says that 1985 trade restrictions were at the top of the congressional agenda. So everywhere there's, I think, this sense of being in a competitive race with vying for supremacy and everything else. Okay, I want to sort of wind down a bit. I'm aware of the time, and I've had to sort of steam through some things. But how do we explain this? I've sort of talked to you about what happened. A good historian, I think, most of the time also wants to think about why it happened. There's a potential simple explanation. I'm not going to play this audio clip because of the time, but if you want to listen to this song in your own time, it's quite catchy, nor am I going to try and sing it at you. Tom Paxton, the folk singer, offers us some kind of explanation here, which is basically a too big to fail explanation. I don't think that really stacks up. At least I think it's too simple. Why is it too simple?
Titanic.
Oh, there we go. You've got a bit of it. But it's a fun song. Why does this not stack up? Well, this isn't true across the board, right? The story here is very different for the steel industry. The interventions to save and preserve elements of the integrated steel industry are very minimal in comparison to the things that I've talked to you about today, despite the fact that community organizations and others are pushing vigorously and putting together their own plans, etc. So what is going on? Well, one thing I think that's really striking, and I've sort of bundled 3 different key concepts that run throughout the book that I'm writing here, is prestige, a concept of something being a prestige industry, and what does it mean for something to be a prestige industry at this point in time? For some countries it means steel, of course, but it doesn't for many elite US actors. It means being at the research and development sort of frontier, if you will, a sort of loaded phrase, but not unimportant. Means corporations rooted in the US, with all of the complexity of what being rooted in the US means in this moment, making high profits, and profits is basically everything that matters. So the computer industry matters because it's the newest prestige industry, and in many ways it's the newest hype industry. Automobile manufacturing matters because it's not just a fungible product like steel. That's a simplification, but let's just call steel fungible. And so a prestige industry, but also, as I said, this sense of one-sided antagonistic development competition, and particularly with Japan. These are the three core ingredients that I see animating it. And you can see here in these Reagan administration memos some of this working. I've given you a lot of presidential-centered stuff, but the story isn't entirely presidential-centered. And then there is what I've called here nationalist globalism. This, again, I've got at it with that culturally rooted in America corporation lines. An idea that that the manufacturing of products globally isn't really a threat, but what is a threat is, as I've said, not being at the top of profit making from a corporate perspective, not being at the top of research and development. For that reason, the rise of South Korea and Taiwan computing industries don't really register the same attention, because they're not viewed as rivals, because they're assembling components for US corporations by and large. So that's some of the story that I think is there, and that's a story that I'm happy to expand on. And I think, where does this story stop? Bringing you to a closing scene. Now, I think some elements of this story remains. Nothing ever quite fully stops, or at least a lot of the time it doesn't. But a lot of these dynamics and core ingredients disappear in the mid-1990s, as I wanted to suggest to you. The sense of antagonistic, one-sided development competition ebbs as Japan experienced its lost economic decade in around 1993. The US economy, of course, booms. During the dot-com bubble, there is plenty of finance capital available for investment and everything else. And by the time the dot-com bubble bursts in the 2000s, there isn't a perceived competitor anyway, right? So why isn't there a market intervention in the ways that I've suggested to you there? I think that's part and parcel of it. So the conversation, in other words, shifts, I would suggest. I'm not saying that anxieties don't remain, but I think a conversation shifts and it quietens in this period. The conversation goes from asking questions about whether US capitalism is working to who US capitalism is working for. The left protests that crescendo with the World Bank in Seattle in 2000 and other things that I could talk about. This is a fundamental shift in the conversation, and it's, as I said, a much smaller group and a much smaller group in that way. So I just want to conclude by sort of summarizing very briefly, and I've put a quote here from Richard White's book Railroaded on the screen. I think this is in a way a powerful quote. It's a 2011 book, but I think what I've got here, there's a clear truism for historians of the state of this narrative, and it's a truism that existed for 19th century historians of the US state for a very long time. Now, as I hope I've started to draw your attention to this afternoon or evening, depending on your time zone. It's good when there's recurring jokes in a sitcom. There's a lot to tease out and excavate in this regard, I think, still for the late 20th century, that sort of looking beyond the rhetoric, thinking about actions. And that what I've also wanted to do, I want to tweak that quote a bit, is to say that we should ask not just how governments shape markets, but what they've done to shape and create markets, adding in a word, in the 1970s, 1980s, explore how they've done it, and I think crucially, and that's a component I've tried to draw out a bit towards the end, ask why they did it at the time that they did. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. So we have some time for questions, and I'd love to open up the floor to a student question.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for coming to talk to us. This was wonderful. I just had a question kind of pertaining to nowadays. I think this is a very coincidental day to be having this conversation with the past couple days and the things that have been happening. In the future, how do you think historians will look back on this time in the US economy, and how do you think it compares to the time period that you study?
Yeah, some of the MA students asked me this question earlier, and you think, having rehearsed an answer already. I'm trying to tease that out at the moment. I'm not sure I will go up in that epilogue to the present moment for a variety of reasons. I'm struck by there are clearly some continuities, and I tried to make them a sort of absent presence in the talk, if you will, but there are very, very strong discontinuities, right? The trade restrictions that are being acted at the moment are sweeping. They're across the board. They're not targeted to specific sectors. They're mostly, of course, tariffs, which are mostly not at all deployed in this trade restriction era. It's these sort of, what I didn't go into with those trade restrictions is most of them happen through voluntary restraint agreements, which basically means that usually the federal government essentially says, in this case mostly to the Japanese government, pressure is building in Congress for trade restrictions. If you get out ahead of Congress, you'll get a better deal. And so this is the way that it's sort of reasonably covert. So there's a key difference there, and there's a key difference too in the sort of, this is not a story in the present moment, it seems to me, of what I called in that talk nationalist globalism, right? It's naked economic nationalism. Look, as I said to the students, the only comparable thing that I think we can see in history, in recent history, is sort of things that Ralph Nader and Pat Buchanan were gesturing at in the 1990s. Perhaps Dick Gephardt. Now I'm really getting into the political weeds, but yeah. But there are very key differences, as I've said. That the scope and scale is, I don't want to underplay that. So we can see some of those same anxieties in that chapter that I presented at Boston University a time ago that I can no longer remember. The sort of final subsection is called Something Old and Something New, and it's playing with exactly what I've been playing with you there. And clearly, one of the things that I would say about the Something New is that actually in many ways those two questions that I talked about at the end are being asked simultaneously for much of the late 2010s, right? Is US capitalism working, and who is US capitalism working for? Those questions are sort of melding together and hybridizing, at least in my view, in important ways.
First, I want to thank you for a great talk. It was really thought-provoking, and you were at the 38,000-foot level. I'd like to move you up to about the 45,000-foot level and talk a little bit about the intellectual atmosphere about economics during this period on both sides of the Atlantic, because that seems to be part of this whole story that is very unsettled. So if you think about this period, this is the period of the breakdown of the Keynesian consensus. So you have John F. Kennedy in 1961 at Yale giving a commencement address where he talks about, I'm in a scientific management of the economy. Richard Nixon, a Republican, introduces wage and price controls to stabilize inflation, which of course worked just terrifically. And then after that, Jimmy Carter is the president who appointed Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve. That was not Reagan. That was Carter, even though Reagan gave him the green light for those very high interest rates to try to tame inflation. On the other side of the Atlantic, you've got Margaret Thatcher with the coal miners' strike, but labor really doesn't remove the nationalization clause from its manifesto until Tony Blair. This is about the early 1990s. And so you've got this period where there's this fundamental shift in how people think about economics, economic policy, the macroeconomy. I wonder if you might elaborate a little bit on that and sort of where this fits into this story, because this is the big shift that seems to be occurring between the mid to late 1970s and the mid 1980s.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you've charted some of the important shifts, obviously the monetary policy shifts and everything else. I mean, one of the key shifts, and I'll just go back to one of my favorites, which is the national industrial policy debate, which I sort of skimmed over a bit. But let's talk about what intellectually what's going on there with that debate. Well, in many ways, that's a very similar reading to the Reagan administration, which is that this is a story of underinvestment, right? Robert Reich in that book, The Next American Frontier, talks about paper entrepreneurialism. I've read that book, by the way, so you don't have to. It says very little in about 200 pages. But the sort of undergirding idea is that the very way that business incentives are geared is to not think about the long term, right? So he's sort of flipping this logic on its head intellectually. He's sort of saying, actually, this isn't a problem with sort of state gearing of the taxation system. This is a problem with the short-sighted changes in corporate structure that are making CEOs and everyone care about short-term stock price fluctuations and not thinking about long-term investments and everything else. So there's a story here of underinvestment. Is what I'm saying to you. Both supply side is where that is, but we usually use the term supply side to mean that Dr. Sexton's favorite napkin, that tax cuts idea, but there's a activist government supply side, right? We usually plot it onto, and actually people know that at the time and sort of saying that. So there's key intellectual shifts, as you said, that I'm dancing around. And one thing that thank you for your question, because it allows me to bring out something that I didn't foreground, which is this is, I've suggested to you, is very corporate centered, right? This is about the employer, not the employee. That's a key shift intellectually. This is about corporate profits. It's not thinking about very much else beyond that. It's about the sense of primacy or singular superpower status and what achieving that looks like in this moment of embracing too intellectually an idea of particularly by the late 1980s, ideas of a post-industrial economy, right? Again, the steel industry, why is it not a prestige industry anymore? Because it's not seen as the economic future for the United States in the minds of some of key policy makers, elites, shapers, even business executives themselves. This post-industrial intellectual way of thinking about what represents the economic future. By the 1990s, this sort of basic manufacturing in that sense is intellectually regarded as just fit for mournful Bruce Springsteen ballads. And in fact, that's happening almost in real time, of course, because Bruce Springsteen is actually sort of elegizing that as a gone way of life, even in some ways as it's happening. But I'm going to try not to get too distracted by Bruce Springsteen and end that there.
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. I have a question about something you said in the talk to describe the U.S. relationship with Japan and to invite you to share more about your background thinking. You described the relationship as one-sided or some kind of one-sided competition. And I'm wondering what you mean by that, and if you're thinking of something like consuming Japan with its argument about internal globalization and how U.S. is kind of globalized by Japan. Is there what more to the story you're adding, basically?
Yeah, I think so. You referenced Andrew McKevitt's, I think he publishes under Andrew C. McKevitt, book Consuming Japan, which is a fantastic book, and it thinks in key ways about globalization as in the 1980s as not just a US story. So that's a sort of book recommendation for the whole audience. Drew is focused on a wide canvas, and so what I meant by one-sided development competition, I'm sort of deploying a term developed by the historian Stefan Link, who writes about development competition in the 1930s and Fordism. But one-sided, the Japanese state doesn't necessarily see itself, I'm not a historian of Japan, but of course I have to be in sort of thinking about this, but doesn't see itself in the same way as in this competitiveness race. But the language of competitiveness is everywhere in this moment. You don't have to look. You can find it in reports about education. You can find it in reports about the internet, the fears of competitiveness within the US and loss of competitiveness, and that the short-term future, decisions made in the short-term future will determine the long-term future. So what I meant about the one-sided development competition, and this is something that Andrew McKevitt in that book I don't think at all brings out, because fundamentally he's not interested in that. I'm not criticizing, it's a fantastic book, but it's not the story he's trying to tell, is to say that actually we need to think in sophisticated ways as to how this sense of competition is shaping and driving policy making in this period. And he's not really interested in policy making, although he has lots of different thematic chapters. And as I said, it's a wonderful book that I learned a lot from, and it came out as I was sort of a few years into this project, and it was one of those great books because it allowed you to solidify some of your thinking in ways that you might not have done had somebody else done it for you.
Hi, I'm Jack. First of all, thank you very much for this presentation. I have, first of all, shout out to Dick Gephardt. He represented part of where I live in South St. Louis County as well as South City. I really enjoyed just listening to some of the things that you said and everything else, and it kind of reminded me of something that I read about and also wrote about in a public policy class that I took last semester, talking about the deregulation of the airline industry and how President Carter actually appointed Alfred Kahn, who was an influential economist at the time, into the position of the Civil Aeronautics Board, which doesn't exist anymore, that regulated the airline industry. And they passed the Airline Deregulation Act in 1978 that kind of opened up the airline industry to a lot of competition. Obviously, it's consolidated to where it is today. It had a big effect on St. Louis, obviously. TWA used to be based out there. They don't exist anymore. There are a lot of reasons for that. But how do you think the deregulation of that whole era had an effect on some of the things that we see today, like with the wealth inequality and everything else? But yeah, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Okay, that's a nice small question. So no, but it's an important one. I'm not critiquing it. I want to be clear. I think that's a very good question. I mean, to pick up more broadly on what you've said, I think the deregulation movement of the 1970s and 1980s, and there's lots of very good historical work on this, is very multifaceted, right? There is people pushing deregulation of different industries for very different reasons, for expanding consumer choice. Now that's not why, as I talked to you about, movement conservatives are pushing for deregulation. So policy outcomes, we should be careful about plotting lots of policy outcomes or broad policy levers ideologically, because as I've said, deregulation proves to us that you can come to a position of deregulation. And of course, it's not really deregulation. It's changing certain regulations. You can come at it from many different angles. But to broach the other facet of your question, which was about socioeconomic inequality, as I heard it, you sort of asked about that and deregulation. I mean, a lot of, again, I didn't really touch with this. Of course, why do people in the 1990s often start asking who is capitalism working for? As I put it, a lot of it is the facets that we know very well of the end of what economists called the Great Compression of the 1950s and the 1960s, when the US middle class, and particularly, of course, industrial workers within the US middle class. The historian Gabe Wynant would want me to say not all blue-collar workers there, and he's quite right, of course, that industrial workers in unionized jobs enjoyed the Great Compression in a way that others didn't. But this unquestionably came to an end, and deregulation of capital gains, of numerous things that happen in this era have their own discrete effects. So I'm in amplifying inequality, and of course, a lot of the policies are upwardly redistributionist, right? A lot of the policies, which isn't to critique them, it's just an observation of them, that the effect of them is upward redistribution in that sense, changing income tax brackets in the way that it is. So there's obviously the world of our times, a world of comparatively high wealth inequality, at least in the 20th century. I'm seeing Jay Sexton out of the corner of my eye and wanting to caveat that with 20th century, is very much born or amplified in this moment by a lot of some of the policies that I scratched the surface of, and I scratched the surface of them for the reasons, as I've said, the key stories the books are telling is telling, and some of the ones I got to in the latter half.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Something that I don't think you mentioned in this talk, obviously correct me if I'm wrong, is the term neoliberalism. And I'm wondering, to what extent is that intentional? That it's such a kind of conventional trope for this time period, and it, in some respects hits on the themes that you're talking about of crossing conventional political boundaries.
Yeah, okay.
Kind of crossing conventional political boundaries, and as a buzzword. And so I'm interested in, are you interested in thinking with that at all? Again, maybe, did you say it and I completely missed it? Or, in a sense, I guess, do you find that a useful term to think with? Do you want to engage with that historiography? Or in a broader sense, what is, in a sense, the specific historiographical intervention of late 20th century economic thought that you most see yourself as engaging with?
Yes, okay. So I'll try and keep this crisp because I have many thoughts and I could do this to sort of grapple with this question till the cows come home. I don't know, that's probably a British idiom, but maybe, okay. It's one of the problems of being a Brit writing in American English is I can do the spelling change, but I don't instinctively know what's a British idiom and an American idiom, but it's fine because I have go-to people to tell me if it makes sense. Anyway, neoliberalism. I teach a whole course, or have taught a whole course on this, which is of course one of the ways we try and think about our thoughts. In the book itself, I avoid using the term. Why? Why do I avoid using the term? Because for me, for a lot of what I'm talking about, and sort of implicit in what I'm saying, I think there is a critique there, and I think it's a little bit too implicit, but it bundles a lot of concepts together. It's a cocktail of ideas, policies, approaches, and I prefer to split them up and think about them individually. Undoubtedly, there is something important going on here. I talked to you about the austerity logics in the New York City case. One of the striking things, if you look at the New York City fiscal crisis, is everybody accepts that the New York municipal state needs to shrink. Abe Beame, the mayor of New York, essentially just wants it to shrink more slowly than the Ford administration, right? There's not a debate over these terms, concepts of public goods, changing all of these things. But I think lots of the cocktail ingredients that are bundled together under that don't necessarily always shine through at different moments. As I say, you've got things here that it's probably too far to push it, but things that you might call neo-mercantilist or even corporatist that are embedded within what some people have called the neoliberal order, right? So it's thinking about how these ideas wax and wane and why they wax and wane. Now, as I said, I think for thinking with a longer view about US history, about the marker of US history, that there is a fundamental shift in the 70s, and this gets back to that intellectual history question that I could talk about for a long time. So if you're looking on a long view, I think there is some utility to it. But for me, I think we need to grapple with, and I guess what I am grappling with is thinking about neoliberalism as more than just a story of unfettered markets, which lots of historians and scholars know, but lots are apt to forget. And I'm not gonna not passive voice that because I'm being recorded. But there's a lot that's here. So fundamentally, as I've said, I'm trying, I think, to push us into thinking about what we might call the neoliberal order, or neoliberal era, sorry, that was a Freudian slip almost. What we might call it in the sophisticated ways that historians have thought about the 19th century US state and gone beyond the simplistic laissez-faire thinking of that time. So I've talked around that question, but I'm happy to talk more in detail individually later, because as I've said, I have a complex bundle of thoughts there and I could do hours on that subject.
As a very old person, I lived through that era, and I appreciated your evocation of some of the more obscure aspects of it, like the covert Felix Rohatyn references.
Yeah.
I did have a broader question, though, about your portrayal, which is sort of behind the screen of laissez-faire rhetoric. We see government interventions, trade barriers, all this almost economic planning even.
Mm-hmm.
And you describe this largely as development of American domestic politics. but doesn't it take on a larger transatlantic and even global dimension? This is, after all, the age of the G7, the Plaza Accord, and many of these U.S. government interventions are only possible because there's cooperation with the Germans and the Japanese and the French in a sort of broader context of, we'll say, capitalist global economic planning.
No, I think that's absolutely right in important ways. There is and this gets to the voluntary restraint agreement, most of the time the Japanese state accepts this. And as you said, the Plaza Accords, the essential agreement by many countries in Western Europe to essentially weaken the value of the dollar in the mid-1980s, brokered at the Plaza Hotel, so named, is essentially based on a reading of US actors that the dollar is too strong. And that is a global story, but it's also a national story. And I write about this I'm doing that annoying thing where I say that actually it's the US Treasury Secretary who instigates the Plaza Accords, right? Again, this gets at the Japan dynamic I was speaking about. It is state actors within the US who sort of say, and why, they're instigating it for many reasons. One is that they do believe that the dollar is too strong and that there will be beneficial developments from weakening the dollar. But as actually journalists recognized at the time, some of it is just because of the trade restrictions building in Congress, right? If you read the Wall Street Journal and things, the journalists, I'm not saying that that's everything here, but this is the background context, which is my why story, is to bring in lots of different things. So that I made the joke of the waterbed mattress industry in 1985, but there's loads of trade restriction bills. And so the Plaza Accord fits within exactly that moment, even as it appears supranational in its way, and it is, but it's embedded within quite a distinct US national context as well. It is what I'm pushing towards there.
Thanks for this talk. It was really interesting. I was struck by your opening few slides, the Time magazine articles, the frequency and ubiquity with which crisis is a language that's being deployed.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering, is there something, what is the relationship to the economic thinking of this period and the idea of crisis? Is it a change from the past in some ways? Is crisis an important way of thinking about the period or selling what's going on in order to deploy the policies of this period? Mm-hmm. Is that part of what you're getting to here a little?
I think yes, and you're right. I sort of use this. I talked about a collective sense of national crisis, I think, at various points in my remarks. That yes, there is this sense of crisis and a crisis out of control that's never fully disappearing from view, right? Memories remain fresh, and everything else. Crisis, I think, there's lots of cultural constructions here, right? A prestige industry is a cultural construction. I actually gave you a lot of high politics, but there's a lot of cultural stories that are important here, and cultural attitudes, as I said, prestige industries, everything else. And obviously, crisis is a cultural construction, right? It exists if you think it exists, and everything else. I'm a bit trepidatious about crisis because it's almost possible to always create this. How do you sort of define when a crisis exists? I think the always acerbic historian Judith Stein once lambasted Rick Perlstein for this in his sort of chronicles of the 1960s and 1970s. He sort of said, well, if you read newspapers, you're always going to find crisis. And so I've lambasted myself a bit there, I guess. But I think there is something about this, as I've said, this collective sense of crisis. I don't want to overthink that. That's what I'm saying. I don't want to over drill too down into it, because it seems to me crisis is slippery, quite slippery as a concept. Now I'm dealing with quite a few concepts that are quite slippery, but to me crisis is one of the most slippery, and that's why I'm sort of very hesitant to touch it.
All right, we have time for one or two more.
I am 2M old. This is history for most people here. This is life for me. I bought my first house in 1981 with 16% interest rates.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. And I actually have a Laffer curve drawn by the man himself. But, you know, you talked about the Reagan recession, the early 80s recession,
Yeah.
as perhaps I was reading between the lines of failure of Reagan's. My remembrance of it was that that was done on purpose to stop inflation. I've said many times that the last time we had adults in charge was with Reagan and Volcker, who, you know, took decisive action at an important time. I wonder if you would comment on that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as you've said, key actors and held their course, right? That was the key actors within the United States, and I'm not going to bring any judgment into this. Key actors in the United States believed and made the judgment that short-term pain, which is always what raising interest rates does, it always creates bankruptcies, that short-term pain was worth the long-term, in their view, economic gain. So what I'm sort of dramatizing about, I guess, what I'm doing with the Reagan, with the 1981 to 1982 recession, and usually those recessions get bundled together, the 1980 to 1982. Technically, they're two different recessions, but that's the sort of nitpicking you do when you're writing a book about this, is you want to be precise. But I guess what I'm trying to do is to, again, focus on this midpoint story that I was saying, that actually not everything changes in January 1981, that this sense of crisis exists. And again, it fuels the second act, what I call the second act of the industrial policy movement. There's a first act in 1980, and there's a second act between 82 and 84. Rohatyn, Reich, Iacocca, Lester Thurow, all of these key intellectual figures are all writing amid this moment. So it again fuels and resurges this thinking and everything else. So I'm not making comments about the trajectory or development of the US economy. I'm rather sort of, as I've said, making comments about what this means for thinking about economic policy, and particularly economic development policy. And I'm aware that's a sort of quite a murkily threaded distinction, but again, we're sort of coming up to about 11 p.m. or something, so I'm not quite as fluent as I once was earlier today.
We're going to make you stay up a little bit longer, Dan.
Go for it.
Okay, what I took from this is that national industrial policy is still around in the 1980s, even if it doesn't quite coalesce into a coherent policy framework. It's still there. We shouldn't see it as like the last gasps of the old New Deal order. It's not the remnant. It's not the last coughs on the deathbed. It's actually something. And you had the slide with the three things that kind of explain it: the prestige, the national globalization, and something else, the competition with Japan, I think it was. I wondered if another thing would be just about military spending. It strikes me that military spending expenditures in the defense industries really place at the center if we're talking about politics in the mid-20th century, and then it kind of disappears in the literature on more recent times, when actually it's still quite prominent and important. In the 1980s, the Cold War's still going on. That might help to explain the industrial policy. So basically, I'm just asking about, is the military at all in your book? Is that a chapter? And does it tell the similar story of some of these corporate municipal bailouts?
The answer is fairly straightforwardly no, but let me say then why. No, I don't deal with the military-industrial complex, let's say, and the military-industrial complex of the Cold War state, albeit I do deal with it in certain ways, which is when I have to talk about computing, right? Computing and the internet is fundamentally a creature of the Cold War state. Why is Silicon Valley where Silicon Valley is? The Cold War. Why do we have the internet? and various things. That's of course a bit facetious because I can't prove the opposite. But I think the military isn't a major part of this story, because you are right that the Cold War is in a different act in the point in time that I'm talking and thinking about. Right, this is this post-detente moment, and yes, the Strategic Defense Initiative, Ronald Reagan sort of attempt to say that he'll create this missile shelter in space. There is a powerful narrative here that I didn't really go into, and again, this particularly comes out with computing. There is a powerful framing appeals for aid that are coming from the business community, appeals for state help around ideas of national security, right? That in the the sort of lobbying association for the semiconductor industry does this in the 1970s, and it doesn't really get much traction, but it sort of says the semiconductor is the oil of American technology. Of course, it's wrapping itself in the sort of energy crisis by bringing in oil there. So there is a narrative of national security. I don't really know what actors think national security is in that moment when they're deploying it. I think it's more of a buzzword in that moment, because Japan is never regarded as a geopolitical threat. It's definitely regarded as a geoeconomic threat, and that is very important to the dynamics that I'm telling. So to summarize that slightly long-winded answer, yes, there is a military story to tell, but I think implicit in what you're saying, Jay, is the point that I'm making, is that that this is in some ways an earlier 20th century story for industrial policy and everything else. And I can think more about that, and I know that Mark Wilson is working on that subject, because he's asked me before if I touch on the military when he's sort of seen me on conference programs and stuff talking about this industrial policy movement, if I do it. But my instinctive sense is that this isn't quite the same story in the 70s and 80s that it would be in the 50s and 60s.
All right, well, I'm going to let you off the hook, and I'm going to ask you my questions later on.
Thanks,
but if we choose to define ourselves in a moment of crisis, I invite us all in that moment to pursue happiness in our reception afterwards. But before that, please, let's give a hand.